live in a world where we get constantly bombarded with perspectives, teachings and points of view. What to believe, who to listen to. Here, I will provide some alternative perspectives. Here, you are encouraged to check for yourself, form your own informed opinions and make up your own mind. From the spiritual to the mundane, join me every week as I dive into some of the biggest and smallest issues facing us all. Hello and welcome to the vodcast of Laird Joy. So let me set the record straight on something very important. E.T. is not God. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the New Age community and a lot of the information that has been kicking around the New Age community for now some decades, a lot of it has been all about ET, aliens, greys, UFOs, and all the like. It seems like a lot of different concepts kind of got all integrated together not long after the counterculture movement of the sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s, which ended up kind of turning into the New Age, what became known as the New Age movement over time. And it kind of ended up in a kind of mishmash of lots of different theories. So part of it is, ufology, and all things UFOs, and anything to do with abductions, and hybrids and all that kind of thing. And of course part of it is spiritual, to do with different, philosophical and spiritual beliefs and belief systems as an alternative to the mainstream sort of dogmatic patriarchal, religions of the last couple of thousand years. And then part of it is, in my view and from what I've seen and research I've done, a certain amount of infiltration by deep state bad actors. And this also dates back to the sort of 60s, 70s, the 1960s, 1970s, when, certain groups infiltrated the New Age, the fledgling New Age scene, and began to influence those who were part of it. One example of that is what manifested eventually into a couple of different books. One of them was called The Only Planet of Choice by Phyllis Schlemmer, and one of the one of her support crew, if you like, who went around with her was a guy called Andrija Puharich, who it turned out worked for the CIA in their kind of DARPA/MK Ultra, whatever it was, deep state projects, to do with mind control and something which became known as voice to skull tech, sometimes colloquially called voice of God tech. The general idea, being that you could actually manipulate what people think to a certain extent, whether it's by use of drugs and by other means, and also by means of technology. And this voice to skull technology was one means by which they learned to achieve some of these desired results. Now, it doesn't actually require, believe it or not, a tinfoil hat to acknowledge this. All you have to do is do a quick web search online, and you'll find that the voice to skull tech actually has a patent, so it actually exists, which is kind of a scary thing. You think that this existed potentially 30 years ago, imagine where the technology could be now. And so the New Age community kind of has been infiltrated by many different means over the past decades, and I don't want to disparage it too much. Being honest, because there is something very empowering about finding your own path in spirituality and not relying on the old patriarchal dogmatic religions that have predominated over the past couple of thousand years. I personally believe in finding my own path. I would say the closest thing that describes me would be paganism or pagan. But I've ventured into a variety of different spiritual beliefs over the last 20, 30 years. And that's just where I am at the moment. It doesn't mean that won't change over time. But what I'm not is someone who follows any of the dogmatic patriarchal religions as they have dominated over so long. I am not part of that. Is all I can say about that. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong in my view of following them. It's just not been my choice and my decision to do it. But there's a lot to be said for finding your own spirituality and your own spiritual way. Especially, for some people who might actually find that they feel at odds, with the religion of their families and of their communities, and they're looking for something different. And a lot of these people sometimes find themselves lured into the New Age community, and then they find themselves subject to all the information that is out there, including some of the stuff that I've just been speaking about. So, of course, the Phyllis Schlemmer in The Only Planet of Choice was declared to be a deep trance channel, and who purported to communicate with a body of celestial entities known as the Council of Nine, or just the Nine. And so they claimed to be what we might have previously known as the Elohim, or if you like, one step down from God. And the spokesperson in the book, who was called Tom, he gave himself that name, although I don't suppose that they have any genders where they are, but he identified for the purposes of these communications as male, gave himself the male name Tom, and stated that he was connected with the being from ancient Egyptian mythology, I believe, known as Atum. Okay, so that was the claim made in the book The Only Planet of Choice. There were other books similarly published, but it was only after the fact, and I read it about possibly 20 years ago, and it was only a few years later, after I had read it and absorbed it all, and had originally taken it at face value, when I came across information while looking around online about this chap Andrija Puhrich. So I'm not going to go into the history of that, because any of you guys listening can go and find out that for yourself. The main takeaway from this is just that you can't necessarily trust information that you see, for example, in a YouTube video, because it is said to be channeled information. It doesn't matter who the channel is, and it doesn't matter who the purported entity is that's being channeled. You simply can't know for sure that the information is good. For example, in the Only Planet of Choice book, the reason that I originally, had some doubts about the book was because although you would imagine celestial entities would not depict the prejudices of planet Earth, when you read between the lines and the undertones of the book, there were clear undertones of the prejudices of the time that the book was written. In other words, you could read the book and identify the same prejudices in Tom implicitly suggested as you could see, from the people of the time, who, wouldn't necessarily have believed themselves that they were prejudiced, but you understand that sometimes people give off an impression of prejudice without necessarily meaning to, and they do so in subtle ways. And this is something that you can identify when you read through this book, and you can see the prejudices of the time present. So this is one of the red flags that you can identify in channeled information, is that some of the prejudices of the time will come through the channel. Also, of course, even if the information is genuine and coming from a genuine entity, you can't necessarily trust it wholeheartedly because of the filter mechanisms present in the channel. That's always going to interpret, to some extent, the information being conveyed. And so, this is one of the reasons why channels often and psychics often work to try to become what they call as clear a channel as possible, by completely emptying the mind and allowing information to come through without any filter, with as few filters as possible. Now, I personally am very doubtful of it actually being possible to eliminate filters altogether, without actually allowing complete possession of your body by the entity coming through. And this is the another slight concern about this is if you are genuinely channeling an entity that is a higher dimensional entity or an extraterrestrial entity, you don't actually know necessarily who it is that you're channeling. It could be any kind of entity, and of course this is perhaps why some of the dogmatic religions I was talking about earlier has rules about psychic work, and often they try to ban it or dissuade you from using it or tell you that it's not allowed within their doctrines or whatever. And I think part of the reason is actually not so much necessarily just because of the doctrines and because they say it's evil. I think it's partly because there are actual genuine dangers. When you do this kind of work, you don't actually know. Even if you channel a genuine entity of some kind, and it isn't any of MK Ultra or DARPA's technology that you're inadvertently bringing through, you don't know where this entity is coming from. There are certain red flags. For example, if you have a genuine feeling of unconditional love flow through your body as you're bringing the entity in, then it's more likely coming from at least a loving source. If that doesn't necessarily still mean that the information is everything that is always going to be helpful to you, but at least you know that it's coming from a positive source. But that positive source is likely to be, far enough removed from our reality as to not necessarily fully understand what our reality is really like. So how do they have a reasonable frame of reference to give advice? On the other hand, the entity could be of a less positive nature and more and closer in density to where we are now. But then that entity is likely to have its own filter mechanisms and biases and motivations. So, for example, if you channel through an ET entity, an extraterrestrial, an alien, if you want to call it that, that ET will have their own particular motivations for the information that they give you. Now, from the perspective of the beings, that information be intended very positively, but it's still coming through with the filter mechanisms of the person who's conveying it to you, and it's coming in at a lower density. Now, one of the biggest concerns is that this is just my opinion, and it may very well be, perhaps a little bit influenced by science fiction of the 1960s through to the 1990s, featuring the likes of Star Trek and things like that. I was always a bit of a Trekkie when I was a kid and growing up, and I always loved the original Star Trek series, and I watched most of the new series that came out in the sort of 90s and so forth. So I'm obviously familiar with the thing coming from Star Trek, which is called the Prime Directive, which is a general idea that if you are, technologically advanced and you visit a world that is not as advanced, if they have not achieved a certain technological advancement, then you shouldn't interfere with that culture. You should allow them to grow naturally. But this actually makes sense in terms of my perception of universal law and free will and non-interference due to free will. That really, if an entity or if an ET or if an alien is positive nature, genuinely positive, they would not be here interfering and passing information through a channel in the first place. They would be sitting up there in their spaceship looking down on their screens and watching us like Captain Jean-Luc Picard might with Commander William Riker. And they would do nothing except watch. And any interference would be accidental, would be inadvertent, and then they would have to try and fix it somehow, I suppose, but they wouldn't deliberately interfere. And that now brings me to my next conversation on this topic, and I'm now thinking about the whole concept of ET as God. So coming back to what I said at the very beginning, ET is not God. They are not responsible for our creation. So regardless if you happen to be someone who follows New Age information, I'm here to give you some bad news. Any information at all that you come across that suggests to you that ET is God is false. Now, what do I mean by that? If you come across information, for example, that says that, we are who was once known as the Anunnaki. We came here 6,000 years ago. We modified human DNA to make them more superior, intelligent, spiritual, etc. We made you who and what you are today. We are your forebears. We are your spiritual parents, etc. And you should take all our advice and do what we say. What I'm here to tell you is that is a lie. I really don't care how high their technology is and how spiritual they believe they are and whether or not they have genuine and sound motivations. If they really did interfere with human DNA 6,000 years ago, that makes them the bad guys. That does not make them good. So this is why I say ET is not God, and this is something to be very, very careful of. Now, this leads me not very nicely because I'm kind of jumping ship here and going from one topic to another, but there is a reason for it. To the topic of transhumanism. So there is a relationship between what I've been talking about and transhumanism. The reason I'm saying that is that I believe transhumanism to be a potential huge threat to humanity, and this is, and I'm going to tell you why. There is a relationship between potentially some of the entities that have been channeled, and a possible transhumanism future. Now, the reason for this is that some of the entities, some of the entities that we identify as being ETs or aliens, are not really ETs or aliens. They simply exist in a slightly higher density from where we are. They haven't traveled from the Pleiades or Sirius, and they haven't traveled from Andromeda, and they've just transferred down one or two densities from where they have been existing, and so they haven't really traveled anywhere. They've traveled from here to here, just in a different density. Now, the issue I've got is that many of these beings exist in the lower fourth dimension, from the information that I've been able to interpret, shall we say. And what I want to say is that lower fourth dimension is what's sometimes known as the lower astral plane. Now, the lower astral plane also has other names. It has names in contemporary religions and in other philosophies. In anthroposophy, it is known as the eighth sphere. So if you imagine a sort of invisible field running, encircling the Earth, which kind of gathers up all the negative energy from all the bad things that happens on the planet, and it kind of just exists in stasis, if you like, around about the planet, and it just kind of soaks up all the negatives. And those who pass, who sometimes find themselves getting trapped there, um, this is some of the entities that we sometimes experience when we have nightmares in our dreams, and we think we're having a nightmare, and it might be a spiritual attachment. And these are the kind of entities that I'm talking about now. So some of these entities may or may not have technology, but they are, for the most part, not positive. Again, coming back to the main point, if they are interfering, and if they are here, and if they are trying to talk to us, and they're an advanced civilization, then they're not positive, because they should be, in principle, because of the universal law of free will, leaving us well alone. So this is where some of the entities are coming from. Now, the relationship with transhumanism is that, where we potentially could go, where we could find ourselves in, some years' time, whether it's 20 years away, 50 years away, and the development of the technology that begins with a chip in the brain to heal, cure epilepsy or something like that, which may, sounds like a very positive thing, but could degenerate over time into, physical so-called enhancements intended to cure other things, provide forms of communication, prolong life, or even, circumvent death entirely. The ultimate aim of transhumanism, I believe, is to circumvent death entirely. And the problem with that is that we'll be so degenerate by the time that we get to that, we'll have lost all our spiritual essence, or at least a lot of our spiritual essence. It's almost like, I mean, this is only my opinion, of course. I can't prove any of this, because a lot of what I'm saying is based on my spiritual interpretation of something, which is supposedly rooted in science. But there is a relationship between science and spirituality, I believe. And I believe that if you mix the two in the wrong way, you effectively degenerate the human form, and it could well be that we could make ourselves susceptible to possession by some of these entities that exist in the lower astral plane / lower fourth dimension / eighth sphere, whichever you want to call it. By the way, Christianity has a name for this place as well. They call it hell. So I maybe should have offered a trigger warning before I made that last particular statement. I apologize if it's a little bit shocking. There are obvious correlations that, demons in hell would correlate to the lower entities in the lower astral plane. The idea of a vampiric entity would relate to, or vampires kind of relates to those vampiric entities from the lower astral plane that will kind of attach themselves to you and suck your life force energy. So there are correlations between them that kind of make it obvious when you think about it that there's a relationship between these places, that they're one and the same. But the good news is that they can't really come here and harm you. So if you do have nightmares and you do have attachments, the good news is that they can't harm you unless you actually allow them in and allow the attachment. And then what they're doing is they're taking, some of your life force, and they'll make you feel weaker and drained and things like that. But they can only harm you to that extent if you allow them. You can tell them to go away, which effectively makes your nightmares go away, which is quite good as well. So they're relatively harmless, in the world as we speak at the moment. And this is the biggest concern I have with transhumanism, is that these entities could become a lot less harmless in 50 years' time, or whether it's 20 years' time, 50 years' time, or 100 years' time, depending on the speed of the technology advancing, these entities, if we degrade our human body enough, that we are so spiritually degraded, that we're so spiritually weak, that we have no more defenses left, it could well be that these entities will be able to get in. And I just feel that transhumanism is a massive danger for the future that we should really avoid. So this is the concern that I've got, and this is where the link is between the whole ET phenomena, thinking about where the information actually comes from, which is probably in most cases the lower astral plane, the eighth sphere. And very little of it is coming from higher realms, really genuinely higher realms, because, any entity that would be high enough and positive enough would have two issues with communicating with us. One is that, they may find it difficult because of the distance they have to travel through the densities to reach us. Even a very good deep trans channel would find it difficult or impossible to actually meet them halfway to actually receive the information. And the other reason is because they're genuinely positive, they just wouldn't. Because they're not going to interfere in the free will of a developing culture. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. If you did, please share far and wide so others can benefit too. And download the podcast audio so you can listen again whenever you like, wherever you like. You can also subscribe to my channel, view and comment on all vodcast episodes by visiting lairdjohn.com. Thanks for listening to the vodcast of Laird John. I've been your host, John McVey.